Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about 5 key tips for writing for an audience that's going to be listening to your presentation rather than reading it. I am once again battling a cold, so I apologize in advance for how I sound. But this is a really important thing to be aware of when writing for any sort of verbal presentation or oral presentation. Now, I've done 2 to 4 scholarly conference presentations per year since about 2009 or so. And in that time, I've seen hundreds of other people give presentations. There are definitely things you can do that work well and things that you can do that don't work that well. Part of the reason that this matters is because we process information differently when we're hearing it than when we're reading it. And this is not necessarily true in all cultures or at all time periods, but today in the West, we are very much a visual culture as opposed to an oral culture. And historically, that has not always been the case, right? The existence of oral literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh or Beowulf or any of these sort of great poems, epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that were transmitted verbally for centuries in many cases before being written down, is evidence that people used to be people in the Western tradition used to be much more attuned to listening to things and processing it verbally. But today, especially in the era of movies and TV as our dominant media forms, we are much more used to seeing things. Podcasts have slightly changed this metric in the past 10 years or so with the emergence of the podcast as a genre people enjoy. But even then, the contemporary podcast is often set up as a video on YouTube rather than the original podcast, which was just an audio file. But anyway, so all of that means that it's much harder for audiences to actually understand the logic of an argument, particularly a complex argument built out of evidence, interpretation of that evidence, and reasoning. It's much harder to understand when we're listening to it versus when we can read, particularly when we can reread anything that we don't understand, right? With a verbal presentation, basically you get one shot to convey to your listeners what they need to know. And so, again, these are going to be 5 strategies, my 5 key strategies, I would say, for making sure that you do that effectively. So, strategy 1 is to incorporate a clear introduction and a roadmap. Strategy 2 is repetition. Strategy 3, simplify. Strategy 4, be much clearer than you otherwise would. And strategy 5 is attribution. So we'll go through each of these and talk about what these are, what they require, etc., and why you want to do them. So, starting with number 1, a clear introduction and roadmap. So a roadmap is a technique that I've talked about before, I think. A roadmap tells your readers, or in this case, listeners, what you're going to do at each stage of an argument or a presentation. This is really important because it helps us as listeners orient ourselves and understand what each piece of information within the presentation is doing. This should be part of your introduction. Along with that, you want to establish your purpose. I am going to tell you X, or I'm going to persuade you of X. Think about every courtroom drama trial show you've ever seen in your life, there's always the bit where the lawyer will say, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today the prosecution will demonstrate X." That is precisely precisely establishing the purpose of speaking. They will then go through and lay out the basic information that they want to present. We will show that the defendant had the means, the motive, and the opportunity, and their DNA was at the scene, and whatever it is, right? That is the roadmap. So what this does is it creates a mental framework for your listeners so that then everything that comes after that, we know how it fits into the overall structure of the argument, right? So when you start talking about the defendant's opportunity to commit this crime, we know, A, why you're talking about that, and B, how that is related to the other things that you're talking about in this presentation. The same thing works with any sort of verbal presentation, right? In the first paragraph, because when I present as a literature and drama scholar, when I do a scholarly presentation, I will write out the entire paper to make sure that it says exactly what I want it to say in the way I want it said. That first paragraph is going to focus on, here's the attention grabber, but then here is what I am talking about. And I will typically include the phrase, "I argue that," at the beginning of my thesis. And the reason for doing that is actually to signal to the audience that this is the key claim that I'm making. But that is part of that clear introduction and roadmap strategy. You want to explain what you're doing and why. So that should be done in the very beginning of the presentation, preferably the first paragraph if you're thinking about it in paragraph terms. The next strategy, number 2, is repetition. Repetition is super, super important because, again, we can't go back and reread something in a verbal presentation, which means that you are depending on your audience to pick up the most important things. And one way you can signal to them, cue them that this is an important thing, is by repeating key points in slightly different ways, right? You don't want to just say this, don't copy paste the same sentence over and over, obviously, but you want to restate the same thing multiple times, because as we hear it over and over again, the brain says, okay, I've heard that before. That must be an important thing. I should be remembering that. Right? So this is the big benefit of repetition, is that by presenting it to the audience in a number of different ways, you tell us, hey, I want to make sure you understand this. Now, if you go back and sort of rewatch that section, you will see that that is a very repetitive section. I basically gave you the same information 3 or 4 different ways, right? I used different language, but I explained the basic premise multiple times. Now, in the course of a longer verbal argument or presentation or speech or something like this, you would want to probably break that repetition up more. Again, returning to key points, key ideas throughout, and connecting whatever it is you've just been talking about with that main idea, that repeated main idea, because then it's much easier for audiences to understand why you've been talking about X point and how it relates to the main argument. The main thesis. And so that's a really good way of creating connective tissue. Number 3, simplify. This works on a couple of different levels. This is really important. But because we have a harder time processing complex information when we're hearing it versus when we're reading it, lower the complexity level. So this will work. On the one hand, a less complex argument is going to be easier for listeners to follow. Don't dumb things down, but consider which pieces are not absolutely necessary for the particular context in which you are presenting, right? So when I'm doing a conference presentation and I am pulling a piece out of a larger, say, article or chapter or something like this, in the article and the chapter, I can go into much more detail, much more depth, much more description, much more theoretical framework, whatever it is. In the verbal presentation, all of those moving parts are going to be much harder for listeners to follow. And so I want to minimize that. What are the key pieces of background, of context, of theoretical underpinnings? What are the key pieces of data I need to present in order to make this argument function? And I streamline out all of the other stuff. Another level on which you want to simplify is generally going to be sentence structure. And I've done a video about sentence structure before, about the different types of sentences: simple sentences, complex and compound, and complex compound sentences. Complex compound sentences are just harder to follow verbally. Simpler sentences are easier, compound sentences are easier, and so these are going to be the ones that you want to rely more on than you would if, say, writing for a scholarly audience, for instance. So, again, be cautious about how much you're dumbing the argument and the style down. But if you can streamline your sentence structure so that each individual sentence is doing less complex work, it becomes much easier to follow. Number 4, you want to make sure that you are being clearer than you normally would in a written document. Again, this is about making it easier for your listener to process what you're saying. So the main strategy for being clearer is to provide more interpretation, more explanation of the data and of the connections between points that you're making. So rather than just sort of stating something and then giving a one-sentence explanation for how that fits into the overall structure of your argument, maybe you give a 3 or 4-sentence explanation. Be very explicit about how everything you're saying fits together. This piece of evidence, this piece of data, supports my claim because, and then explain that because. Why does this piece of data? Or let's say you just made an important supporting point. Now, this supporting point connects to and supports my main thesis because. In these ways, it shows that my central argument is correct. This sort of extra explanatory motion within the argument will make it much easier for viewers or listeners to see the connections that you are claiming. And this is especially important. This is one of my key principles of rhetoric that I always tell my students. Evidence is not self-evident, which means that someone else can see a piece of data and interpret it to mean something different than what you're interpreting it to mean. That's especially a problem when you are dealing with verbal arguments and listeners may not be following that connective tissue in as much detail. And then last, my fifth suggestion is attribution. So this really, this applies when you are using source material, right? So quotations, data from research sources, information that others have generated, etc., etc. Rather than, so when you're writing in MLA, APA, Chicago style, whatever it is, you can either do attribution, which is where in your sentence you say something like, according to X scholar, according to X author, according to X government agency, whatever it is, whoever that data has come from, here is that data. Or you can do a parenthetical citation or an endnote or footnote citation in the case of Chicago style. The parenthetical citation in APA or MLA would come at the end of the sentence, and generally you would not read that aloud because it's going to disrupt the flow of your presentation. And so you want to do attribution, right? You want in your sentence to say, X author says quotation, because that tells us where that information is coming from. We know before you get to the start of that quoted material that this is going to be a quotation, and so it makes things very clear. Now, how you actually choose to signal quotations in your presentation, there's a couple of major strategies people use. Personally, when I get to a quotation in one of my presentations, I just shift the tone of my voice for the duration of that quotation and then shift back to my normal presentation voice, which is hopefully the non-sig version of what you're currently hearing. Some people will say quote at the beginning and end quote or unquote at the end. That's a perfectly fine way of doing it. Some people don't really like that strategy because it disrupts the flow of the sentence. Some people will do air quotes either at the beginning and then typically not at the end, or all the way through. We'll just do air quotes. What I'm saying right now is not actually quoted material, but I'm giving you an example of how that might work. And I know one guy who regularly will read like the first 2 to 3 words of the quotation, stop, and then say, and I'm quoting here, and then go on. That works really well for him, but I would not recommend that as a general strategy. But you want to think about how you're presenting quoted material, how you're signaling to your listener that this is someone else's words rather than your words. And you want to attribute that information before you start with the quotation. So make sure we know where this information is coming from. So those are my key suggestions, ways of dealing with the challenges of a listening audience trying to process something complex. You want a clear introduction with a roadmap. You want to use repetition, especially of key points. You want to simplify things. You want to clarify things, and you want to attribute source material.